Hey historians, it's Mrs. Tyler. We are finishing up Unit 4, Note 6 on the Progressive Era. This is Part 2. All right. Working conditions during industrialization were terrible. Long hours, low pay, often dangerous working conditions without any guarantees that a worker would keep his job. We looked a little bit about this when we did our investigation, our history investigation for the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory tragedy. Okay, workers were viewed as kind of a cogs in just a big old machine of big business, and the owners who were owners were mostly concerned with profit rather than the safety and well-being of their workers. Okay, so the problem is working conditions for laborers were unsafe and unfair. Many children were working in dangerous jobs instead of getting an education. Adult workers were up against many challenges. More immigrants meant more potential employees, all of those people competing for the same job opportunities, and businesses could easily find replacements if employees tried to complain about the long hours, ask for a raise, complain about hazardous working conditions. Reformers like Samuel Gompers worked to unify workers through labor unions. This would unify those employees to give them all a voice. Some unions organized strikes to stand up to powerful business owners and convince them to make wages fair and workplaces safer. This was one of the readings that we had in that Triangle Shirtwaist Factory investigation. There was a whole reading about Samuel Gompers helping the female garment workers to get together and go on strike and make their workplaces safer and ask for better treatment and better pay. So labor unions is a vocab word on page 19 in our notes packet. So labor unions are organizations created to unite workers and give them a larger voice to demand better pay and safer working conditions. Individually, if you complained, you could be fired easily and quickly replaced. But if not just one factory, but all of the workers in an entire industry, like the garment workers, no matter what company they worked for, if they were making garments and they all unified together and went on strike, they could make, it would be much more difficult to replace all of those workers in that same industry at once. So they had a little more leverage and they had a little more negotiation power, and they could get their voices heard more as one big unified group. This is Samuel Gompers. Okay, he helped to establish the American Federation of Labor and unionize workers. Child labor was common. Children worked in dangerous jobs, mining. They worked in factories amongst big machines that could take fingers and limbs off. These children were unable to get an education because their families needed the income, so they had them working to help the family out. Reformer Mother Mary Jones once noted, "Every day little children come into the headquarters, some with their hands off, some with their thumb missing, some with their fingers off the knuckles. They were stooped little things, round-shouldered and skinny, many of them not over 10 years of age." Mother Jones once noted that it's because of this that Jones and others people worked to end child labor. So Mother Mary Jones fought for safer working conditions, shorter work days, and an end to child labor. Reformers like Samuel Gompers and Mother Mary Jones worked to unify workers through labor unions and give employees a voice. Some unions organized strikes to stand up to powerful business owners and convince them to make wages fair and workplaces safer. So the solution is organizing workers into labor unions to have a stronger voice and demand better working conditions, and also passing laws to make it illegal to hire children. They start passing additional laws called compulsory education laws, so that we have children getting a free public school education. Okay. During the era of Reconstruction, after the United States Civil War, Southern states had passed laws meant to segregate people in public places based on race. Violence was also an issue between 1892 and 1903. 3,000 African Americans were lynched, which means they were without being accused of a crime, without a trial or a lawyer or a jury of their peers. They were hung or hanged across the South. Homer Plessy. This is Homer Plessy. He was arrested for resisting segregation and refusing to obey a Jim Crow law. The law was that the rule by the railroad company was that there were colored train cars for black passengers, and there were white train cars for white passengers. And Homer Plessy was biracial. He bought a regular ticket, sat in the white train car, and was at the next station removed by police and arrested for breaking that rule and that law. Okay, so doesn't feel like this is very equal. So he took his case all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1892, the Supreme Court ruled that public facilities could be segregated for people of color, saying that they were separate but equal. Okay, although they had equal access to riding the train in this situation, or using a bathroom, or getting a drink, the quality of those resources, or those, just the quality is going to be different. Okay, the drinking fountains aren't going to look the same. The bathrooms, many of the bathrooms in the South for people of color were outhouses, while the indoor bathrooms were reserved for whites only. Okay, the train cars for the passengers of color were not as well kept. They were not as nice. They were not as comfortable as the white train cars. The schools that were segregated. I'll show you some photographs of that here in just a minute. African Americans argued that segregation laws violated the 14th Amendment, which grants everyone citizenship regardless of race or color, and the government should protect citizens from these discriminatory laws. They also wanted protection from violence of like the KKK with the lynchings that was happening across the South. So here's an example of the white schools and the schools for students of color. Okay, the white classrooms for students of color. Not exactly equal. So the problem is segregation is legalized. When the Supreme Court ruled on Plessy versus Ferguson, African Americans continued living with inequality. Reformers working to bring about racial equality during the Progressive era had different ideas on how to respond to education. Okay, so there's going to be a few different groups working for change in different ways. Okay. Booker T. Washington was born into slavery. He believed that education is the answer. He felt that African Americans could create their own opportunities and still get a quality education. He did not want to wait around for white people to decide it's time to, provide a quality education for black students. So he established his own college, the Tuskegee Institute, as an all-black college. Okay, so Booker T. Washington founded the Tuskegee Institute to provide quality educational opportunities for African Americans. You're going to remember him because book is part of his name, and book and education kind of go together. Also, he founded the Tuskegee Institute, so look at his middle initial. His middle name is not Tuskegee, but it helps us to remember that he founded the Tuskegee Institute that starts with a T. Okay. W.E.B. Du Bois took a different approach. He felt that African Americans needed to fight segregation, and rather than just put up with it and live with it, he founded the NAACP to organize the African Americans to fight racial injustices. And it's a legal institution to sue companies and parts of government that are participating in unequal treatment of people. So he establishes the NAACP, that stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Color People, to fight segregation and expand equal rights for blacks. All right. Women had been trying to gain voting rights, or suffrage, since before the Civil War. In 1890, the movement to gain women's suffrage gained strength. So the problem, women had very few rights and lacked the right to vote in elections. Susan B. Anthony led the National Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. This reform movement focused on trying to change voting laws state by state to expand voting rights to women. Okay, Susan B. Anthony led NAWSA in 1890 to fight for states to give voting rights. 10th Amendment says anything that's not officially put into the Constitution remains a part of the state's rights to make laws about. So she was tackling that by trying to work state by state. However, that takes a long time to happen. On page 19, we're going to define the term suffrage. It has nothing to do with suffering, so don't get that confused. Suffrage is the right to vote in elections. Progress is slow, and by 1900, only 4 states, all of them out west, had granted women suffrage. The first to do so was Wyoming. The Progressive era helped reinvigorate the suffrage movement and expanded the focus nationally. This is Alice Paul in 1916. She decided that trying to win suffrage state by state for women was taking way too long. She decided it was time to push for an amendment to the Constitution, because then it's not up to the states anymore. If it's in the Constitution, then that requires all states to give women voting rights in all elections, local, state, and federal. She formed what became known as the National Women's Party, the NWP, and organized a parade in Washington, D.C., where more than 5,000 women marched for suffrage. People booed and jeered at them, while newspapers applauded the courage of these women marchers. So Alice Paul created the NWP and fought for a constitutional amendment to women's suffrage. In 1918, women began holding silent vigils outside the White House under the leadership of Alice Paul. Hundreds of women were arrested for blocking the sidewalk, although that goes against their First Amendment rights of freedom to petition and freedom of assembly. Alice Paul and her supporters went on a hunger strike while they were in jail, and the jailers force-fed them. The women were ultimately released and cheered as heroes. In August of 1920, Congress passed the 19th Amendment that granted all women in the United States the right to vote. So the solution is to unite women in organizations like NAWSA and the NWP to work for women's voting rights. Congress passed the 19th Amendment in 1920, giving the women the right to vote. On page 2 in our notes packet, we have our timeline for the unit. The 19th Amendment passed. It goes in the spot for 1920. Public support for a ban on alcoholic beverages, or prohibition, increased during the Progressive Era. The idea was that banning alcohol would help alleviate problems associated with drunkenness and alcoholism. The largest organization that was pushing for this prohibition was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So even before women had gotten the right to vote, there were many women who were involved in political things, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They were founded in 1874. They argued that drinking alcohol made men unable to support their families and unreliable. Many became violent and participated in gambling while drinking. It cost families a lot of money and heartache. Some men became violent and abusive. The 18th Amendment went into effect January of 1920, and it made the making and sale of alcoholic beverages illegal, so it banned them. So on page 19 with our vocab, please highlight the 18th Amendment banning the production, transportation, and sale of alcohol that lasted from 1920 to 1933. And the Women Christian Temperance Union, organization that spoke out against the evils of alcohol and worked to close saloons and ban alcohol. So the progressive solution is the temperance movement worked to close saloons and pass the 18th Amendment to ban making, selling, and transporting alcohol. Many Americans didn't feel that drinking was harmful. They resented the government interfering, and people who wanted alcohol still found ways to get it illegally. Illegal nightclubs known as speakeasies sold liquor. People called bootleggers made money by making and transporting alcohol illegally. An unintended consequence of the 18th Amendment was that crime increased. The growth of organized crime in nearly every major city brought gangsters who fought to control the flow of alcohol and money. One example is Al Capone, who had a private army of over 700 criminals. By the late 1920s, it was obvious Prohibition was a failure, and it was repealed in 1933 with the 21st Amendment. Okay, so that brings us to talking about the amendments that happened because of the Progressive Era. 4 new constitutional amendments are made, and these amendments were meant to better protect citizens. So 16th Amendment is an income tax. 17th Amendment is that states now directly elect senators to Congress by popular vote. The 18th Amendment from 1919 to 1933 is the Prohibition Amendment that banned the making, sale, and transporting of alcohol. And the 19th Amendment in 1920 expanded the right to vote to women in all U.S. elections. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great day.